Good morning, party people, and welcome to Gulfoss waterfall in Iceland. Big giant waterfall on the Golden Circle. It's a beautiful waterfall with upper and lower viewing areas where you can view down at the bottom plus up at the top. Just utterly gorgeous, makes a great sound. And of course I try to mask that sound from you when I do things like office hours because I don't want you to have to hear too much of that. So let's go see what you've got in here for questions for SQL Server. Accidental DBA says, "Hi Brent, my friend inherited management of 4 SQL servers running Enterprise Edition. How do they determine if these instances are licensed properly?" And then he's got another question after that, and I'll answer that one in a second. So there's no way you can tell from SQL Server itself whether or not the licenses have been acquired. SQL Server is one of those applications where you can just install it as many times as you want once you've got the binaries. Microsoft doesn't phone home for licensing in the sense that they don't check your licensing before the application runs. So what you have to do is you have to work with your accounting team to go find out. And the way that I like to ask it is, have you got any receipts of over, say, $50,000? Because typically it tends to be a rather large expense. And then you'll also find out who your reselling partner is for licensing. The other way that I'll do it is I'll say, okay, here's how many cores worth of Enterprise Edition that we're using. Here's what our licensing expense would have been at one time. Can you look for a license or a licensing expense that was that much or higher? People often freak out because there was no licensing check involved with it. So the way, as an outside consultant, the way that I ask clients is I'll say, all right, I'm not the licensing police, but I want you to think about, here's how many cores of Enterprise Edition you're using. Here's what your licensing exposure is. Would you like help reducing that exposure? And then usually companies will say either no, we're not worried about it, which means they're licensed, or yes, they are worried about it, which means that they're not licensed, and it's time to start doing some performance tuning to try to minimize your licensing spend. Next up, Jose asks, "Hi Brent, which activities would you consider mandatory for a company to offer database managed services for SQL Server?" That's a tricky question. Honestly, I don't know why. If you're going to do managed services for SQL Server, if you're as a customer, I don't understand why you wouldn't use Azure SQL Database, Amazon RDS, or Google Cloud SQL Server, because those are ginormous companies. They specialize in that kind of thing. And I think it's really hard for a startup company to go and try to offer managed services to compete with them. If for some reason you felt like you still wanted to, the thing that I would do is go look at Azure SQL DB's brochure, so to speak, look at all of the services they do for you, and that would be considered what I would consider table stakes. Because if you can't even compete with Azure SQL DB, there's no way that you're going to be able to compete out in a wider playing field. Next up, Mr. Griffith asks, "What advice can you offer about defending SQL Server backups from ransomware? It seems like anything with a CIFS share would be vulnerable." What you want is a write-only, write-once file share, where the SQL Server backup service is allowed to write new files, but not allowed to modify those files. Your systems administrators can work with you on setting up permissions like that, and then that way, even if your SQL Server gets hosed, even if someone else's application gets penetrated, then the file share still shouldn't be writable by anything else. Then actually go through and test that, because if you can go in and delete backups, or if you can use the SQL Server service account to delete backups or change them, then you're still not really protected. Accidental DBA says, "Hi Brent, enjoying your new scenic office hours format around Iceland." Right? Am I right? Any chance? Hold on a second. There's somebody else had a. Well, here, we'll finish that one. Any chance that you can do something similar back in San Diego? Yes, I plan on doing that because I actually have a couple of cars that I absolutely love. I have a Porsche 911 Targa and a Jaguar XKRS. I love them, but I put maybe 3,000 miles a year on them with the pandemic. Well, now that I'm vaccinated, as we start to head back, I'm going to be doing more road trips and doing more of these from out and around. I've already got road trips planned to Las Vegas and Cabo San Lucas, so I'll be doing them from a few different places. So going back a little earlier, Accidental DBA had also asked, what are the possible consequences if my SQL servers are not licensed properly? So if, like, a past employee calls Microsoft or whatever the Software Publishers Association is and says, hey, I know this company that's not actually licensing their servers, Microsoft may be able to send their licensing auditors in and try to strong arm your company into doing a license audit, and then getting into compliance can be very expensive. Because once you are already using those licenses, it's super hard to do negotiation because they have you over a barrel. Next up, let's see, Random Name says, I have a friend who has this vendor who set up their application's database access using local accounts rather than a real service account. I think this is a bad security practice, but I'm not sure how to describe exactly why it's a bad practice. Any advice? Okay, so I don't do security work at all, period, full stop. And sometimes that's controversial because people can say, can you do database work and not do security? But this is a great example of, if you're not doing this full time, you may not know the latest nuances with this, because it does change. For example, for a lot of versions, it was normal to use an NT service account because you wanted to be able to assign permissions to write to a backup share, like we were just talking about. And it was usually easier to do that if you were running under a service account that was managed by Active Directory. Then came things like managed service accounts and group managed service accounts. They introduced complexities with always-on availability groups. So this is one of those things where I don't keep up with any of that anymore. What I would do is if you want to start making changes to security, let's go hire a security firm who specializes in that kind of thing. Or pick up the book, Securing SQL Server. Now, it's kind of old, but I think some of it may still be applicable to the question that you're asking, so give that a shot. Next up, Oleg says, my friend was wondering if there's any difference between using inner join versus just listing tables, like a comma-delimited list of tables, and then joining them using the where clause. I see you using inner join all the time in all your class examples, and I wonder if there's a reason for using one method or the other. Thanks. T-SQL is a declarative language. In T-SQL, you are declaring the shape of your result sets, not the shape of your execution plan. Oh, you can declare the shape of your execution plan, but it's usually a pretty bad idea. Usually you want to let SQL Server choose the execution plan based on what you're trying to do. So if I'm declaring the shape of my result set, I want it to be as easy to understand as possible, as quickly as possible for my fellow human beings. I also want to minimize the chances that I'm going to make a mistake. For a long time, when people were doing the comma-delimited list of tables and then joining them in the where clause, that was when you saw all kinds of errors where people were like, oops, I forgot to join that table. And you'd end up with Cartesian products and your SQL Server was a smoking pile of ashes in the basement. So for me, inner join is much more reliable in reducing errors and getting other human beings to understand the query quickly. Also helps as well if you need to comment out a few tables during testing. Next up we have, let's see here, Abner says, hi, I occasionally have spikes in waiting task count in Activity Monitor, like 200,000 or 400,000. What would be the methods to detect the reason behind this? Me personally, I don't believe in using Activity Monitor. Activity Monitor will hide things from you. It doesn't show you what's truly happening on the server. So what I would recommend instead is that you start using, goodness gracious, lots of phlegm this morning. I would start using SP Who is Active or SP Blitz Who instead. What these stored procedures will do is they won't hide things, and then also they'll show you exactly what the waiting tasks are. So check out, if you search for either of those, SP Blitz Who or SP Who is Active, I have videos that are totally free out on the site explaining how to use them, and those tools are totally free as well. And then we'll take one more question. Let's see here. Mr. SQL Seeks asks, when performing an impact analysis before making a change, currently it's all manual, using text search tools and manually walking the chain to determine the affected resources. Do you have a tool you like to use for performing impact analysis? No, because the problem with whenever you're making changes is you're not just affecting things inside of the SQL Server engine, you're also affecting C#, Java, all kinds of other applications that you may not even have access to. You may have queries that are building dynamic SQL. I have one client that builds dynamic SQL with Perl. So clearly when you make a change like an index change or a table change, you can't survey all of those parts of the application. Doing this work is best done by a good friend of mine from Spain, Manuel Labor. Get it? Manual labor. There we go. Probably a good dad joke to end on. All right, so that is the end of today's office hours. I will leave y'all with a minute of watching Gulfoss. Thanks, and have a great morning, and I will see y'all in the next office hours. Adios.